Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second in our Navigating the Turbulence of COVID-19 webinar series. Today, we will be discussing leading in a crisis, and we welcome all of you and are very excited about today's conversation. My name is Katie Montgomery, and I'm the Associate Dean for Degree Programs at INSEAD, and I also happen to be the current chair of the Crisis Management Team at INSEAD. So I am very excited to hear what our great guest has to say today. That is Declan Fitzsimons, a senior affiliated professor of organizational behavior. And so I'd love to introduce Declan. He is coming to us live from London. I'm currently in Singapore. The team managing this webinar is in France. So this is a truly global business school for the world experience. And Declan has some really interesting ideas and thoughts, and he's done research on shared leadership, on senior teams, on leading in complex environments and organizational change. So all of his research topics are very relevant. He has great INSEAD-like experience, having worked with the state, with foreign investors, with regulators, all in the post-Soviet era throughout Europe. And he's currently, in addition to teaching at INSEAD and as a great member of our faculty, he's also consulting in the energy, pharmaceutical, FMCG, and banking industries. So he's having conversations on a daily basis with clients about how they're handling the COVID-19 turbulence and disruption, and what are the leadership's issues facing current organizations. So I'm going to pass it over to Declan and let him take the lead. Thank you so much, Declan. We appreciate having you today.
Great, thank you very much, Katie. Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking some of your time to tune in to this webinar, which is actually quite short. I'm very aware of time. 45 minutes is not very long to cover a very important topic. I don't have slides to share with you. I was thinking about this. I thought I could structure this around some slides, but to be honest, I was really thinking about what's different about this particular crisis, and how is it different from the other ones that I've been involved with when I'm working with businesses that are trying to deal with things. And so I'd really like to do an introduction which is about this particular crisis, and share some thoughts and ideas with you. How are you? I mean, that's a question, isn't it? It's a question that we normally ask every day, kind of, how are you? How are you? But I think now it has a different resonance. So the difference between how are you and how are you doing? I mean, here I am, I'm in London, I'm in my home. So the work and home have in some way collapsed together. And so one of the things I actually wanted to talk about is, I'm going to structure this with three questions. What's happening at the moment to us and to others? And the reason I want to ask that question is because I think it's one of the disciplines of leadership in a crisis, is to continually update our sense of what is going on with me, what's happening to me, and what's happening to the people around me. And of course, there are bigger questions, such as what's happening generally in the world with the virus and the economy and the business, of course. But there's also these closer to home questions, which are essential, particularly because in a crisis, a lot of the questions we have around leading are related to how do I communicate? How do I talk to people? And for me, the question of how do I show up? How do I need to show up differently now than the way I normally show up when business is going as usual? So having this idea of what's happening is really important to me and to others. Then I'd like to think about, well, how do I make sense of what's going on? Are there any theoretical ideas or concepts that might help all of us navigate through some of this and answer that question about how to communicate? And the third piece would be around, well, what should I actually do? So that's how I'd like to engage with you. So what's happening? What's happening to me? What's happening to all of us? Well, one thing I think that's happening is that there's a disruption going on around normal routines, the kind of things that I'll do every day that if I'm moving from home to work, I would normally do the usual things. You get up, you have breakfast, you deal with what's going on around you. There's a certain order to things. The last thing you do might put on your shoes, pick up your car keys, down to the garage. down to the garage and drive, or you get a train. So there's a disruption to these everyday micro routines and little rituals that tell me that I'm moving from one space where I'm at home with family and loved ones into another space where I actually have another role. And that's been disrupted at the moment. There's a kind of way in which, well, I'm at home, and lots of people who were normally going through that process of transition, of going from A to B, are not going from A to B, they're going from A to A. Obviously not everyone, but for many of us, that's the case. And that's one disruption that's going on. And by the way, for some families, that's become a big issue in itself, because if you have two of you working and you have children, and there's whole ways of managing this, now you find yourself in a situation where both of you are at home, and maybe the children are at home, and they have to be homeschooled. So there's a not for everybody, but there's a lot of people for whom suddenly the home itself has become almost invaded by other things to do. And by the way, I'm going to talk about some of those things, but I'm mainly going to be focusing on work. However, I just wanted to mention that a colleague of mine, Professor Jennifer Petriglieri, that many of you will know, she's written a fantastic book called Couples That Work. And she's putting up a series called, it's a survival series for couples that work at home. And that's going to be available in short videos. And we'll send you the link afterwards. And every day she's going to be taking up a particular challenge that couples in that situation, the dual career couples where both work, now the children at home, and the careers are now kind of having to be contained in the home. She's going to be sharing some ideas on that every day. So do check in with that. It's marvelous. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the work, what's going on in the work area and how we lead in a crisis. So the first thing I've mentioned is this disruption that's gone on. The second thing is that the job itself, for many of us, our jobs are actually changing shape. And for some of us, even the relevance of our job at this particular time is even in question. I know colleagues, I know client colleagues, shall I say, clients who are working in learning and development, in HR areas, where suddenly the whole role has shifted. They're very, very busy, but somehow the priorities have shifted. And of course, I also have many, many clients who are working in operations, where usually the job is getting something done. You know, that's my job. I've got the supply. So the suppliers come in this way. We put our work together. We send it to our clients. So there's this kind of linear process of getting the job done. So that's not quite there anymore. It is there, but I run 5 plants, for example, but now I'm not running them anymore. I'm closing 3 of them and reducing the work in 2 others. And that doesn't feel like the job I came here to do. So people are experiencing a disruption of routines and rituals around moving from home to work. They're also finding a disruption around, well, what's the shape of my job these days? And the third thing, of course, is that people are really uncertain about the future. And these 3 things together, disruption of routines, disruption of the shape of the job, and a disruption in terms of, will I have a job, or what will that look like? This is causing an enormous amount of unease in organizations. And that's what I really want to talk about. There's lots of things we could speak about, but I really want to focus on the emotions that are being evoked in us all in response to a challenge, which is, for many people I've spoken to, and certainly myself, I've not come across before. This is new in my life. My life has been disrupted beyond the usual disruptions. Usually one part of my life is stable, the other one is wobbly, and et cetera, et cetera. But now it's as if everything has been condensed into one location called home. And that's putting a lot of pressure on the systems where I show up, the systems where I love and I live and I work. And that's really what I want to speak about. Because if you're asking questions about how should I communicate, we can't answer that question without exploring, well, what's happening to me at an emotional level? What emotions are being evoked in the people that I work with, and how can I work effectively with those? So that's what I'd like to talk about. And so that's kind of what's happening. I think we need to have a rich picture of what's happening to people, because that will help inform how we then communicate. So I think working on that rich picture, always asking what's happening to me, what's happening to others. So then this question of, are there any concepts that can help with that? And of course, I've introduced this first one, that there's unease, and I'll use the word anxiety. Anxiety it's often an experience which gives us a lot of discomfort, although we can't quite name it or find exactly where it is. It's a generalized sense of concern and fear about something. It's an anticipation of something not so good might happen in the near or medium future that leaves us with a sense of discomfort. And so to answer the question, how should I lead in a crisis? The first thing is really asking the question, what's my response? How am I doing? And this sounds like an easy question, but for many of us, it's not a familiar or easy question. For some of us, our response to the anxieties and the emotions that is being evoked by all this that's happening is, for example, to become very, very busy. I don't want to feel anxiety. So we all have strategies to avoid it, some very sophisticated strategies, some that are more effective than others. It might actually be quite useful strategies. But one might be, I'm just going to start becoming very, very active and actually working more than I usually do. And by the way, that might be an okay response, because work does need to continue. But it's just being aware. This is the critical thing about leading in a crisis, is not doing A or doing B as alternatives. It could be that A is fine and B is fine. But the critical idea of leading in a crisis is, at what point does what I'm doing start to be something else? What I mean by that is, here I am, I'm busy, I've got my team together, we're talking about crisis management, we're thinking about how we can respond. There's this and that, that's fine. But leadership in a crisis is noticing, at what point are we becoming busy for the sake of being busy? At what point does busyness in a crisis serve an effective response to the crisis? And at what point does it start to become something which is helping us avoid another kind of conversation which we might need to have? And that's a judgment call. There is no formula I can offer you. There is no book that can give you the answer to that. At what moment does your busyness in a crisis actually stop to be helpful to what it is that you're trying to do? And that's the fine judgment that we need in crisis. And we cannot do that unless we're monitoring, we're checking in with ourselves as a practice, as a leadership practice, checking in with myself. How am I doing? What's going on with me? Sometimes I call this the morning diagnostic, like within the first half an hour of the day, I'm trying to work out what's going on with me today. Am I a bit edgy? Am I more edgy than usual? Am I withdrawing? Am I withdrawing from the people I love and care about around me? And maybe that's okay to withdraw for a little while, but maybe it starts to become, again, that edge. Where does my withdrawing stop being helpful and becoming something else? So a key discipline for leading in a crisis is really being able to monitor myself and ask myself, what's happening to me? How am I responding? How am I dealing with my anxieties? Am I becoming extra active as a way of pushing the anxiety away? Or am I becoming active in a functional and useful way to serve those systems? At what point does it change? Or am I withdrawing? That might be another response. I go into myself, in which case, what's happening? Is this helping or is this getting in the way? So self-monitoring is critical. So that's one of the key disciplines around leading in a crisis, is the ability to check in and what's going on. Of course,
Declan, I think that's amazing. Do you mind if I ask just a few follow-up questions? We've got a pretty active audience here. I think they're wondering, how do you balance between self-reflection and checking in and doing that morning diagnostic, but at the same time, handling the pressures of being there for a team, keeping them motivated, a team that also is probably going through quite a bit of the daily routine disruption, but also worried, am I going to have a job tomorrow? Am I going to be able to cover the tuition? And where could you potentially find yourself crossing into a line or crossing a line where, again, maybe you're over helping in order to avoid, handling your own personal response to the crisis. Any suggestions or thoughts?
Yes, thank you. There's this whole idea of how do I use this precious resource called my attention? That's all we have in a way. Where do I place my attention? And leading in a crisis, well, leading at any time, but particularly in a crisis, you don't have the luxury of taking time to just reflect while everything else is going on around you. We have to reflect while we take action. So it's not an either or, it's both. So I have to be there in the room with my team. I'm sitting around the table, and my job is to do two things. I have to monitor what's happening to me in order that I can monitor what's happening to other people. You can't do one without the other. If I block out my own feelings and emotions, I'm not going to be able to see them in other people. So this is like there's a symmetry. It's impossible for me to work with other people's emotions while numbing my own emotions. This is one of the great myths. One of the great myths of emotional intelligence is that actually we should control our emotions to be effective in the workplace. And actually, when we control them, we actually numb them. And when I numb my emotions, I'm no good to anybody in a crisis. And what I need to do is, in fact, engage my own emotions rather than control them, so that I feel my emotions, and that will allow me to read the emotions in the room. So let's say in my team, I have one person who, I'm a little concerned about, because I know that he lives alone. He had a divorce. I know he got divorced last year. I know he's been struggling. He loves work because it allows him to really, get himself together. And here we are, he's at home all the time. And we're checking in, we're having our meeting. If I'm not aware of my own emotional life, I have less chance of being able to see and notice what I call the weak signals that tell me that my colleague is in trouble. So I'm sorry, it's a long answer to your question, but just to emphasize again, it's not either or, it's and. I need to be able to self-monitor while I'm engaging with others. But yeah, thank you.
It's almost like on the airplane where it's like you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself before helping others, in the crisis. I think people are also wondering about how to communicate in this time broadly to their organization. So how do you have a balance of empathy, and I understand that you're not at ease, that you're experiencing anxiety, but also, creating communications, for lack of a better word, that are tight, that are clear, that address audiences across the board. How often should we be communicating? How much should we be getting into the details? How much should that be cascading into other departments? What's your advice on that in terms of communicating during this crisis to help people in the disruption?
Sure. Regularly, so that's a key thing, is regularly, more than we would perhaps be comfortable with. And the key thing for me is that people often don't communicate in a crisis because they feel they don't have anything new to say. It's the biggest mistake. I'm going to communicate when I've got something new, but I haven't heard anything. I'm still waiting for the board to tell me, or for this people to make a decision. Then I'll tell people. No, the metaphor we often use for communication is broadcast. How do I broadcast better? How do I be clearer? How do I structure things better? But I think in a crisis, we need to reverse that. And the key metaphor for communication is not how do I broadcast better? It's how do I create a space in which people will feel that they can speak to their experience. So I see myself standing, or if I'm doing it virtually, everyone's online, and I'm actually speaking and sharing some of my own experiences and updating, but actually my job is to create a space in which others will have an opportunity to speak. So it's not broadcast, it's receiver. And I think many of us get that wrong in a crisis. So regular, more than you might imagine they need, and particularly don't make the mistake of not communicating just because you have nothing to say. You should always be there so that people can speak up.
I think that's amazing advice. And maybe talking, we've talked a lot about our own employees, but what about, for lack of a better word, of managing up? What about communicating? Oh, we see you now, Declan. And so what do we do about managing up? What about staying in communication with our supervisors or managers, or liaising with the board or those external stakeholders? What would you advise in terms of communication there? And again, going into this, how vulnerable should you be, outside your actual team?
Wonderful. This theme often comes up, and I'm really fascinated by it. And this question, how vulnerable should I be when I speak upwards, sideways, and all of that? And for me, I think of a metaphor which may not be helpful for everybody. It works for me, which is that being vulnerable, a lot of people feel that being vulnerable makes you weak, or it gives the impression that you're not a leader, or you're not in charge of things. And I think in some ways it's right in a way. If being vulnerable allows you to, by being vulnerable, you have a sense that you're in charge. So I say to people, you stay on the horse. The metaphor I use is you can be as vulnerable as you like in a way, as long as you're clear, I'm still in charge, or I'm still in my role, rather than necessarily in charge, but I'm still solidly in my role. I'm a leader. And for me, this comes back to the idea of, you don't have to know more than the people in the room, but you do need to be the best learner in the room. So vulnerability for me is connected with learning. And in a crisis, that's all you've got. Because when there's so many things around you happening that are new and different, you're not going to get it right all the time. And so the vulnerability should be connected to an ethos of learning. And how that links to leadership is that I'm the lead learner in the room. I don't know everything that everyone in the room. I'm surrounded by experts who know what they're doing in their areas. I can't possibly know what they do. And I think if we think that leadership is knowing everything and knowing more than other people do, we're really in trouble. But I think if we understand leadership as I'm the lead learner, which it creates a culture in which vulnerability is the currency of leadership. If you're not vulnerable, it means you're not learning. And if not learning, what are you doing in the room? Because in complexity and in crises, being the fastest learner is going to help you recover fastest from the crisis and get back into where you were. So that's the way I think of it.
So Declan, it's pretty amazing how it's almost like you use the buzzword that I want to ask the next question about. And so you're talking about, recovery. If you're a lifelong learner, you're going to be someone who's going to be able, to recover or step up once we've seen this pandemic slow down, we flatten the curve, it passes. And we've had an interesting question is, how do you put the fires out, manage yourself, manage your team, but at the same time be thinking, in the here and now, which right now none of us can predict what the here and now looks like at any time, but then at the same time be ahead thinking this pandemic will not last forever and ever. And so how do you take advantage or be ready so when the recovery comes, you can put your company, your organization, your team in a place where it could be most successful? How do you balance, or how do you manage that when you're a leader of a team?
Okay, thanks. I think that there has to be space for people's emotion at this time. So I think one of the things that leaders need to do in order to get to the space of creativity, because I think what you're describing is, how can we but being together in a creative space where we can start to focus on reality. And we can't get there unless we give space for some of our emotional responses, which might include there may be people in the room who are a bit down and they're saying, oh my goodness, the business is not going to survive. There needs to be a bit of space for some of that. And as a leader, how do I create space for some people to express some of the doom and the gloom stuff? Keeping an eye, knowing as a leader that this is a necessary step to the creative space where we start to join together and say, yeah, but it is going to be over, which of course it is. But I think if a leader jumps and says, I don't want to hear the doom and gloom, I just think we need to think about the future, this is going to be over, that's too fast. And if you're uncomfortable with people's I don't know, catastrophizing for a little while, if you won't allow that to happen in the service of that, then I think you can get, so that's what I would say, that will come if you give people space. Trust that people will start to say, yeah, but it is going to be over, isn't it? Because we do know they don't last forever. So.
Right. I think it's interesting that you mentioned catastrophizing or people who are fatalist or, black and white thinking. We're all guilty of it. And do you have any tips for if we as leaders catch ourselves in that, black and white thinking trap, or if we have our staff, what are any kind of, rules of thumb or ways to approach that, or any kind of tips that you could give to prevent that thinking for ourselves, but also to try to encourage our team, to kind of try to get out of that catastrophizing?
Yeah, I do have something that I often think about is notice it and name it and allow it to be what it is. And the more you do that, it ceases to have its power. You can decrease the power of that kind of negative stuff, not by sanctioning it and saying we must stop that. But there's a very fine line between doing that and actually noticing it. So if I'm doing it, if I catch myself catastrophizing, the key thing is then to talk to people about it and say, okay, here I go again. I'm noticing in myself, I just have this, this need to imagine that the whole world is going to end. So I'm just going to get it out of my system and then let's move on. Or have you noticed what we've been doing? We've just spent the last 10 minutes in a kind of a very kind of black and white view of things. So, okay, we've done a bit of that. It's fine. Now let's move on. So you give space, you give it some oxygen, but not too much. If you give it too much oxygen, you're in trouble. If you don't give it any oxygen, then it will come out in other ways. So again, it's how do I manage the boundaries around these things is critical.
That's good. And you mentioned boundaries, which I think, if we're realizing what's happened and how we can make sense of it and what can I do, maybe one of those action pieces is boundaries. Do you have any suggestions for boundaries when you're working from home, boundaries when you have children in the house, boundaries when your spouse is there? How would you set up boundaries, or what's a good way to kind of implement boundaries? Because we know it's easier to implement, but to stick with boundaries. Any advice in that space?
I think I can speak to boundaries in general, home and at work, and how we work with them. I think first of all is an appreciation of boundaries, that how absolutely critical they are. So I think that using the word and noticing where the boundaries are around homework versus TV time, in normal times around the children, perhaps those boundaries would be of one kind, but now that they're at home all the time, then the deal and the contract might change in some way. So I think introducing the language, using the language, and even negotiating what they might be. And as you say, sticking to them, but not so rigidly that they create more problems. But I just think the language of boundaries and understanding what they are and how vital is a big step forward for all of us. I also recommend that people do check in with Jennifer, with Professor Petriglieri's program, because she'll be picking up on a number of these things in a very, very effective way, I'm sure.
Good. That's a wonderful suggestion. What I want to talk about is, are there any special ways to approach fear? So in addition to having the disruptions and the ambiguity, we do have some people who are very fearful for loss of job, for their own health, for the health of their loved ones. For example, at INSEAD, we have some students who are far away from home and borders are closing. Is there a special language or a way that leaders should address the actual topic of fear? And do you even address it that blatantly and in the face?
I'm a great fan of naming things in the room. I think it's very helpful. I think vocabulary and having a slightly different vocabulary in times of crisis is important. Allowing new words into the room, words like loss, even grief, sadness. They may not be very business-like words, but I think they're important. And I think fear is one of them. So I think that the naming and labeling of it, and again, giving it some oxygen and permission is important. a couple of things do come to mind. One is a practice around reaching out to others. I don't know about you, Katie, but certainly lots of people I'm talking to are saying that they are connecting more with other people than they used to do, and I'm doing that. So I think if you're feeling fear around that, it's really important to find some kind of secure base, a person or persons where you feel you can actually talk about those fears and name them for yourself. So there's the verbalizing, the connecting with someone that you trust, a loved one or close friend. Then there's the more physical stuff. And from what you said, what you said when I disappeared, and I'm very sorry about my disappearance, but what I imagine happened is that lots of lovely suggestions came up from the audience, some of which would be around these issue practices. How do I breathe? I mean, the number one thing that comes to my mind is breath. And this sounds not a very business school thing to say, but we breathe thousands of times every day. And if I'm feeling fear, one way, of course, is breathing into that fear, literally deepening my breathing and calming myself down. Because I find that a lot of my fear responses are attended to shallowness in I'm breathing just at the top of my chest here. And I'm not really doing a bit of the old deeper belly breathing. I know that sounds a little twee, but actually it's a wonderful discipline.
That's great advice. So I was wondering if we want to go back to your original structure, and if there's a piece that you want to, address or kind of give an overview.
Yes, I think it would be this: be gentle on yourself. You're not going to get this right all the time. Probably everyone is really already doing their very best with it. And so one of the things I wanted to say is that when we try to creating a space for others to express some of the feelings that are going on, I think is going to be critical. One point I wanted to make about emotion quickly, I know we're short of time, was that we often have emotions at work, and we often struggle with even those emotions related to getting things done. But what we have now is a lot of emotions related to not being able to get things done. And so there's almost a new set of emotions in the workplace. And so we need to give space for grief and loss and confusion, disorientation, so that some of the people you're working with will be experiencing things that they don't even know how to name. And as a leader, if you're able to give them some space to label those things, such as a sense of disorientation or loss or even grief around a role that's no longer there, and not to emphasize your need to communicate by broadcast, but really to create a space in which people will feel that they have permission around you to say what's really going on for them. And many people will not do that because they will experience you as a leader as someone who just wants to get things done. You're about task. Well, if you're just about task in a crisis, you're in trouble, because you have to be about emotion and feeling and connection first in order to get everyone to move on to a new definition of what the task must be and should be. So I would go for emotion, creating a space in which emotion can be explored first, as a way to then creating a space in which we can move on to new definitions of what work looks like.
I think that's really interesting. What are the telltale signs that you may be going down that task-only path?
Telltale signs. I guess everyone has their own way of doing it. But finding your energy. Really, there's a way in which we start to move around with it. We start to say, let's get the flip chart out, or let's bring up that slide. I mean, all we can do is notice it. And I'm coming back to this idea. There's a fine line between being active towards the task in a productive and good way, because we do need to get ourselves together and have hope that they will come out of this. That's really important to convey. But all we can do is check in and self-monitor and say, Declan, you're beginning to overfunction. I thought of that this morning. Before coming on this morning, I thought, I haven't really been in the classroom for a while. I'm going to have 45 minutes. So there's a real danger that I might start overfunctioning. So I was kind of trying to monitor. I hope I haven't overfunctioned, but it applies to me as much as to anyone else. All we can do is do the two things, is to reflect in the moment, pay attention to what's going on, in the service of what's happening in the room. So I can't do better than that in terms
Yeah.
of.
I'd love to ask you just, a follow-up question. It was really interesting. I had my entire team on a Zoom call and we were using the Q&A and I was like, any questions? Any questions? And I was in that overwork mode, and sometimes the space is just silence, which is actually a little awkward when you're on video. It's and particularly if you are, sometimes the person who is for lack of a better word running the meeting. But I found it very helpful, particularly in the digital world and when we're online. But what are other tricks for space, or in addition to that silence? And are there any other tricks or any other advice that you would have on creating space when you're in a digital world rather than in the face-to-face world?
Yes, I really do think this is a very important topic. Is how do we work with silence as a leader? Because we could actually, I know you've asked me to talk about something other than silence, but I think that silence itself is many things. What kind of silence do we allow around us? What's the quality of that silence? Is it a calm, peaceful silence, or is it a nervous silence? So I do think that as a leadership practice in a crisis, creating space by tolerating a little more silence. And I have there's a client who's also a close friend who often talks about how cross-culturally that's really important too. That actually tolerance for silence may be different for people from different cultures. So I wouldn't underestimate that. But in the virtual space, I do think creating new routines and rituals around silence is really important. Visual is really important. Audio is not great. I think we should be visual. And I think that if we can, on virtual space, as in face-to-face, but certainly virtually, is giving people time to check in. And what that means is if you're going to have a meeting for an hour, maybe it should be longer, because you might need to give the first 20 minutes for space. And as a leader, you can go last. So you're not the first person to check in. You're going to go last, and you're going to say, okay, so we just check in, everybody. And then you leave silence. And you don't have an order to it. You don't go alphabetical order. You don't go around the table, none of that. You allow who wants to speak, speaks. And if nobody speaks for 30 seconds until the next person comes in, that's fine. So I think having rituals where you don't try to overstructure silence because you're uncomfortable is not helpful. And so that critical idea of let's check in and let's see how we are, and let the order be what it is, and including silence. So that's just give you a taste of the kind of thing that I think we can do in a crisis.
No, it's brilliant. So I want to, leave the last, 5 or so minutes. If you want to, close out, and leave us with parting words. Your advice has been amazing and brilliant as always, and we really appreciate it. But I'd love to leave the last words to you before we close out the webinar, and any thoughts or any tidbits that you want to share based on leading in a crisis.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Katie. Well, but can I just acknowledge you, Katie, because I disappeared. And you handled it really well. So maybe the best learning on how to lead in a crisis is by observing what you did in my absence.
Well, yeah. Let this not be anyone's standard. So, but thank you.
And just to emphasize, it wasn't planned from our point. It wasn't like, let's show them how to lead in a crisis. I'll disappear halfway through. So that wasn't planned, but thank you, because I think you demonstrated leadership, which was, you keep the show on the road. But I also want to thank those people who responded in my absence by coming in with suggestions and things. I think that's really helpful. It's amazing. So in a sense, it was an enforced silence. I disappeared, and then you see that people do come forward, and I really appreciate those who've been listening and helping out in that way. In terms of some thoughts in the last couple of minutes is really that perhaps it's a moment for thinking about what the virus is actually doing for all of us. I mean, it's an extraordinary period in our lives, and there's something. So maybe this is a little philosophical, but it does give me. I can take some hope from it. It is creating devastation in the lives of many people, and it's heartrending, and it's a tragedy. And that I don't want to. I'm not going to qualify that in any way. That's what it is. I think the challenge that the virus gives us is that in the last 5 or 6 years, I feel that the world, from a leadership perspective, has been torn in two, that somehow we've ended up in a more polarized world. And of course, we discuss whether it's the internet that does this and how the algorithms feed us all with more of the things that we already believe. But I just noticed how before the virus came along, I lived in a world, certainly in the UK, where people were talking about Brexit and will the country be unified now that we've had this big split. And the virus comes along, and in a sense, it is offering us the possibility as mankind to up our game in some way. I think the possibility, because the virus doesn't take any, well, it's indifferent to skin color, nationality, to whether you voted this way or that way. And I think it's that, and we, at some level, we realize that. We realize that somehow we've been doing all this stuff for 4 or 5 years around there is no such thing as reality, there is no such thing as a fact. Well, I think the virus has come along and reminded us and said, well, I'm a fact. And if you want to mess around with me, I'll kill you. I mean, that's a very dramatic thing to say, but as a biological threat to us, it has reminded us that there is such a thing as reality. And I think as leaders in a crisis, there's also that bigger piece that we have to hold on to. What are we being told? What is the message that we can take from a dialogue between mankind and nature, in which nature is actually saying, you know, look what I can do. If you're not going to listen to this, I have more. So I do think that I have great hope that we can actually learn from this, and perhaps we can up our game on behalf of the whole planet, and on behalf of those we love and care about very much. So that's what I wanted to share in closing.
Thank you. I think those are amazing words. And if anyone's going to up their game, it's going to be a lot of people from INSEAD who believe in business as a force for good, and that have been taught by amazing professors like you. So thank you so much. We really appreciate all your words of wisdom. Just a reminder to everyone on the call is that we will have all of the Q&A, and we're also going to take some of the chat comments, and we will definitely put it in the Lifelong Learning LinkedIn channel. So let's all continue this conversation. Some of the ideas and suggestions, I plan to go into the document myself and learn from all of you, to be one of those lifelong learners that Declan encouraged us all to be. So as I mentioned, this is only the second webinar of many to come in the Navigating the Turbulence of COVID-19 webinar series. I want to remind you that we have these 4 on deck, but we're planning many more. And if you have any ideas about topics, any ideas about speakers, please let us know. This is a very important learning experience for the community. And thank you everyone for being here and joining us tonight. And we appreciate everything. So thank you so much. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and keep doing business as a force for good. Thank you.